I would say one of the strongest evidence for the young Earth creation view. And I'm not too sure if you're familiar with it. I imagine since you are a former young Earth creation, you are. But I'd have to say that it's genetic entropy, right? Like on a biological level, that accumulation of, say, those near neutral and very much deleterious mutations over time. Because we know that neutral mutations, they're obviously not recognized. They're kind of invisible to natural selection, because neutral mutations are obviously neither beneficial nor, harmful. So if those are building up, in our genome and we are slowly degrading over time, to me, that sounds consistent with, say, the biblical fall. But it seems to me that it's inconsistent with, say, pond scum to people, bacteria to biologists, evolution. Like, how do you feel about that, science enthusiast?
So as far as the genetic entropy argument works or goes, I would say it shows a little bit of a misunderstanding of entropy. So actually, if you don't know, I used to so shortly after my whole you could say new birth, when it came to accepting evolution, I was a science teacher, and so one of the things I taught was physics. And when it comes to entropy, yes, everything in the universe is, you can say, going through this entropic state. Everything is going towards decay. But with the Earth and planets that are close to it, close to the sun is feeding energy into the Earth. That's why we have things like photosynthesis and plants growing and stuff like that. It's the sun that actually makes that argument of genetic entropy null. You would be correct if the sun was not feeding energy into the sun, but because that is the case, there isn't this thing of genetic entropy. Thank God, because we have the sun feeding energy into our system, uh, and so that's what I would say against that.
So I think, okay, so if we look at, say the first law of thermodynamics, right? The law of conservation of, say, mass and energy. Would it be accurate to define it as, say, energy obviously cannot by itself be created nor destroyed? Obviously, energy can be changed, from one form into another, but obviously the total amount always remains unchanged, right? The fact that matter is, just another form of energy, that still applies obviously to that basic rule and law of the first law. Would that be an accurate portrayal of it?
Right. Sure.
But then, okay, so now for the second law of thermodynamics, you're saying the law of increasing entropy. So obviously the energy available, kind of like to reiterate what you said, for, say, useful work in a functioning system tends to decrease, even though based on the first law, the total energy obviously remains constant. But so obviously we agree on the first and second law of thermodynamics, but I think on a biological level, the
Uh-huh.
word entropy, we're using it differently, right? We're just using it in its general term to mean, decay, going, say, downhill. And on a biological level, I'm just talking about that mutation buildup, right? So I'm not really talking about the second law. So I understand what you're saying, and I'm in agreement with that. But the word entropy in regards to our genome, I'm using it in a totally different context. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I, I'm not aware of genetic entropy of any kind. That's kind of something that younger creations use a lot. But like I said, so because the sun is feeding into the system, because the sun is feeding into the earth, you don't have this thing where our genome is decaying over time and et cetera, et cetera. You would be right if the sun wasn't, if the sun weren't feeding us energy, but that is the case.
Well,
Um,
and I understand what you're saying. I think, when it comes to the entropy that we're talking about in regards to closed system versus open system, the sun's energy, making its way into the earth, that's totally different, because instead of using the word entropy, I can certainly use the word genome degradation, because what I'm referring to is those near neutral mutations. Say, because we know that 100 to 300 mutations per person per generation, they are unselectable, right? Because they're neutral. Now, if natural selection can't, say, select these out, if natural selection can't remove these, much like a single rust molecule is invisible, say to a car inspector, the rust will slowly, invade the car and deteriorate the car over time. Just like these near neutral mutations, the accumulation of them will degrade the genome over time. So sure, I'm using the word entropy, but I can certainly use the word degradation. Like if those neutral mutations aren't recognized by natural selection and selection can't remove them, how is this, genome degradation problem going to be stopped? Go ahead, science enthusiast.
Yeah, so it's not a thing where I would say our genomes are degrading because of mutations. So mutations actually are not a bad thing. So when you think about things like different insects, how different insects are more geared towards their environment than others. Some insects or animals are different colors and different shades of green and blue, and etc. It's the randomness in that mutation or in those mutations that allow for those things to happen. So it's not a bad thing. For example, like how we have different skin colors and how we have different like I just said, different colors. Those things are only allowable if we even have mutations to begin with. So mutations aren't a bad thing. Mutation just means random, and when I say random, I don't mean it in the sense where it doesn't have any purpose. That's not how scientists use it. When I say random, I mean uh, unpredictable. So these are unpredictable mutations. They can't be predicted. They're highly unpredictable, and these mutations allow for random things, or they allow for different
Okay.
things to happen.
And I understand what you're saying, and I'd be in agreement with that. I think if I can put it and explain it better, and kind of just to reiterate a lot of what you said. Obviously, we agree that when living things reproduce, they're making a copy of their obviously DNA and they're passing it on to their offspring, right? But obviously, these mutations, which I would just say are typographical errors, they're mistakes when they occur. I would say that if it's, say, a neutral mutation, which isn't actually recognized by natural selection, that means they're going to build up in the genome. So on a personal level, it's going to build up in our genomes, but on a population level as well. So based on, say, that downward spiral, eventually, based on that accumulation of unselectable mutations, it's going to be unstoppable, because obviously natural selection, it can't choose between, say, fit and less fit, because if we're all technically mutant, some may be more mutant than others. That means the population is going to descend into, say, sickness and eventually extinction. So I'm just wondering, because I agree with what you're saying about random mutations, changes, but I'm just saying if these neutral mutations cannot be selected for or against, and they're slowly building up in the genome, much like rust builds up on a car, because a single piece of rust doesn't affect the fitness of a car. Just like a single neutral mutation, say a point mutation on one nucleotide, it's not going to affect the fitness of the car, but it's the spread of them over time. That's what degrades the genome, much like the rust degrades the car. And I think that's consistent with the biblical model. I guess my question would be, how is natural selection going to stop this problem if we're all accumulating 100 to 300 new mutations every generation? Go ahead.
So yeah, mutations wouldn't be the problem. A better way to, I guess you could say, formulate the argument is we haven't seen that with mutations, but we have seen stuff like that with viruses and diseases, or for example STDs. For example, about like 3 months ago, 4 months ago, there was a guy in Egypt. I think he got super gonorrhea from a very adventurous night he had with a prostitute. And he goes to the doctors and he tries to get cured, and the gonorrhea evolves and it changes, and they give him more antibiotics and the gonorrhea changes. And so we don't see that with mutations, but we do see that with viruses and different diseases. So if you were to argue that, you would actually be correct. Nobody's denying that. But as far as mutations, I don't think that's how it works.
I guess I would say that, in my model, mutations at the end of the day, they're not, construction, they're destruction. But if we actually look at, say, a real-time example, say, let's use Lenski's long-term bacterial experiment, if you're familiar with that. So we know that a very trivial adaptation happened, because what it was optimal growth on a given medium, right? But Lenski's bacteria, what they actually did was they shrank in genome size. So in other words, the functional genome, it actually decreased. So it became evident with this experiment, and they're still observing it, that the more rapid growth in these bacteria, it was actually very much and significantly accomplished through genetic degeneration. So it's actually a fact too that many useful genes, say not essential in that artificial environment of Lenski's experiment, they're actually lost, which means at the end of the day, not only are they lazy and they're handicapped in that environment, when transferred to a natural environment, those highly degenerated bacteria, they would certainly be dead on arrival. So right there is, real-time evidence of that genetic degeneration, which once again, I'm just saying is consistent with the biblical model. And I don't understand how natural selection is going to be able to stop this degradation problem. Like, do you have a solution to it? And how do you feel about the Lenski example? Are you familiar with Lenski's experiment? Go ahead.
Yeah, I've heard about it. It's been a while since I've even looked into it, but from what I understand, as far as the Linsky experiment goes, the bacteria broke off into another species, and there were like a couple generations of evolution, and so you can see over over a large period of time, like 30 years of evolution, Linsky he for younger creationists, I would say he demonstrated macroevolution. He demonstrated evolution on a large scale. Um, so that's pretty much how I understand it.
Well, at the end of the day, because this aerobic citrate digestion by bacteria, that was the big one that was seen. If it involves, say, the loss of control of the normal anaerobic citrate digestion, and it's sure, it's an adaptation, but it's a very much, degenerative adaptive change, that's not going to, take your fish to fishermen. Because if we're seeing, losses of information, we're seeing genetic degeneration, that's no help to large scale evolution, because obviously we agreed that the word evolution means a change in allele frequency in populations over generations. But if these changes are degenerative, that's more consistent with a young earth creation model, because obviously there's a shelf life on these genomes if we're accumulating these mutations, right? I mean, do you understand that a neutral mutation is not selected for or against?
I've never heard of a neutral mutation, but yeah, define it for me.
So a neutral mutation is it's neither beneficial nor harmful. Okay, so it's slightly deleterious on a genomic level, right? Like if you have a point mutation on, say, just one single nucleotide, sure, it's not going to be noticeable, on a phenotypic level, but on a genotypic level, it is slightly deleterious because you're still messing with the message. So natural selection acts on the phenotype, not the genotype. Therefore, it's not going to recognize that mutation. So over time, these mutations, because we actually accumulate 100 to 300 and pass that on to, as long as it's in the reproductive line, we pass that on to the next generation. So as generations go on, they build up, much like rust builds up on a car, and we slowly degenerate. So if you take that back to a point of least genetic entropy, that'd be a point of creation. But that would have to go back 6,000 years ago, because based on what we know about the accumulative damage, it can't go back, say, 200,000 years ago, millions of years ago. It's just not possible. Does that make sense?
I hear what you're saying, but as far as evolution goes, remember I'm more of a physicist than a biologist. As far as evolution goes, evolution as I know, it doesn't teach this thing of like degradation. I do know in evolution there are trade-offs. Like for example, some dinosaurs they traded, what was it? They traded I think they traded walking for flight, and for example, Homo sapiens they traded strength for intelligence. So, for example, some people say, "Oh, humans lost their strength. Humans could have been bigger and stronger and etc." But it was a trade-off
Are
because
you
humans got
saying that they're
smarter.
trading off like one? So is this like a mutation that's beneficial trading off for like what's the trade-off exactly?
Yeah. So with humans, it would be our loss of muscle mass for brain capacity.
Okay, so, but
Um,
obviously there's going to have to be some. So I think it comes down to like with what I'm saying in regards to genetic entropy. If you don't understand it, too much or you're not too familiar with it, I would certainly uh, recommend looking into it because I think it's very strong evidence for the young Earth creation model. But I think the bottom line in regards to it uh, is that selection that we're talking about. It's going to remove only the worst deleterious mutations, but it's going to amplify only the best beneficial mutations, right? So what that means, and this is the most important part, that means that the accumulating damage is actually largely invisible, right? Like rust on a car, like I was saying, while adaptations tend to be highly invisible. Let's say antibiotic resistance, for example, right? So that means if you say presented us with 1,000 examples of say adaptation through beneficial point mutation, you still have to address the key issue, which would be a net loss versus a net gain. Because I'm sure we can agree that adaptation, obviously, it explains the fine tuning to an environment, but it's not going to explain, that large scale bacteria to biologist type evolution, because that's going to require massive amounts of novel and meaningful information into the genome, right? But if we see degradation, it's just not possible. And that's certainly consistent with biblical creation. How do you feel about that?
yeah. I I don't think that's how it works, but sure.
Well,
You
if,
got
if
any,
if you think
go
about it, because if we agree that neutral mutations are not recognized by natural selection, I mean, they are going to build up. I mean, you obviously have to have an explanation for how natural selection is going to remove them, because just like rust on a car slowly builds up over time, and sure, one single rust molecule is not going to affect the fitness of the car. Over time, it will degrade the whole car, just like these near neutral mutations. And that's the whole point of calling them neutral, is because natural selection won't act upon them, right? Like, for example, I should ask you, do you agree that natural selection acts on the phenotype versus the genotype?
Yeah, I no idea what those two are. I'm more of a physics guy. Um, but I will say so as far as that goes. And if you don't mind, I would like to move to a different topic because it's just kind of going in circles now. But I will say from what I do know, as far as the whole loss of information and stuff like that, the only thing I'm trying to understand what you're saying, but the only thing I guess I could kind of relate it to
Yeah.
is like allopatric speciation or something like that, where you have
Yeah.
two species, and let's say there's a chasm or something where the two species can't get back together. Over time, they'll get so genetically different that by the time they come back together, they're now two different species. And that isn't necessarily a thing where, oh, like this species is going to die out or something like that. Uh, it, it's just how different species are formed, and that's how you get like different ring species and stuff
Well,
like that.
if you look at say the genetic drift that would occur in that, those mutant alleles, they're going to drift into these new species, these new populations, and a lot of times these new species, they're created. A lot of times, say a small heterozygous population, it's going to tend towards homozygosity. So there's actually going to be less DNA variety in that population, right? For example, a wolf to a chihuahua, they're the same kind of animal. No one's going to disagree with that. But the allelic variability and the allelic variation in the wolf is much stronger than obviously in the chihuahua. So it's still a form of information loss. It's still a form of information degradation. I'm just asking you these questions because obviously if you came out of Pawns Come to People evolution, I think it's important that you come out for the right reason, right? Because genetic entropy, I've had many discussions with scientists on my channel, probably about 20, and ones that are very familiar with this, and I'd recommend going to watch the discussions. They literally have no explanation for it. And Dr. John Sanford has done many different models in regards to these accumulation of near neutral mutations, and it really does put a shelf life on the genome. And like I said, if you look at Lenski's experiment, these bacteria, they become lazy, they become degenerate. I mean, this is consistent with the young Earth creation model of decay, degeneration, right? I mean, go
So
ahead.
would you say this the whole it seems to me the genetic entropy argument comes from the interpretation of like Genesis 3 and God told Adam and Eve they're going to die and blah blah blah. It seems more like a religious motive than a scientific one to me.
Well, I mean, it's being seen in the lab. Actually, evolutionary population geneticist, for example, Alexei Kondrashov is his name. He actually said, based on these near neutral mutations, he's not a Christian by any means. He said, "Why are we not extinct 100 times over?" So he recognizes this problem. It's kind of a trade secret among population geneticists, but Dr. John Sanford, he came out of being an evolutionist. He's still a population geneticist, but he took that trade secret about genetic entropy and this accumulation of near neutral mutations, and he's kind of exposed it, obviously for what it was. And he's actually, talked about many of the world's most prominent population geneticists, and they all agree that man is degrading. But the thing is, they have to hold to that primary axiom. They have to hold to that evolutionary worldview. So obviously, there has to be a solution out there somewhere. But for someone like me, I sit back and I think, wow, what we observe empirically, it's actually consistent with the biblical model and the biblical fall, right? I mean, you can Google neutral mutation. You'll see that, natural selection, it won't recognize it. They will build up in the population. Like, I should ask you, from an evolutionary perspective, since you were talking about allopatric speciation and speciation in general, would you say that the ultimate cause of genetic change is mutation?
That can be one, and there are like 3 or 4 other factors that lead into it.
What would you say the other like factors? Like, for example, the DNA say the millions, I should say the tens of millions of DNA differences, nuclear DNA differences, mitochondrial DNA differences, say across species that we observe. Would you say that those are all based on mutation?
I honestly don't know. I'm more of a physics guy. Um,
Well, I guess my question would be, how come you decided to give up on, the biblical model if none of this seems to be coming to you as something you've heard or understand? Because, to believe in a model of death and such as evolution, I should say bacteriobiologist evolution, I don't think God would, certainly work that way through his creation. I mean, we can agree to disagree, but the empirical evidence certainly suggests that there is degradation going on in the genome. There's also decay going on in the universe. So I don't think, what would be your biggest, because I understand you're a physics guy, but if you now believe in evolution, what was it about evolution that made you think, wow, evolution is true? Like, what is it, if you don't mind me asking?
well, it was there were many things. So number one of the things that was really interesting to me is that I guess I'll ask you, uh, when was it that you decided, or when was it that you were convinced that I guess the younger position was valid or plausible?
I I was convinced based on the fact that when I looked into it, because in school I took courses on this, and I found it funny that their mechanisms of choice were in the neo-Darwinist view is natural selection, which is, it's really just means differential reproduction, right? It's a selection fine-tuning process, selects from pre-existing information. And mutations are destructive, mutations are deleterious. And I found it funny that, this is what they believe is going to take the fish to fisherman. And I looked into it, and I certainly talked to a lot of evolutionists, and I said, where's this new, novel, meaningful information coming from to take your fish to fisherman? And the answers I got and the evidence that was provided, I spent a lot of time on talkorigins.com, and the examples that were provided to me were laughable. And I thought, what I'm seeing here with these degenerative changes, they're certainly not going to take your fish to fisherman, but they're definitely consistent with a biblical model. So I haven't looked back ever since. I've studied tremendously in depth in regards to genetic entropy, mutation, accumulation. And to me, I will never look back and think, wow, evolution's true, because from what I know and what I've understood, I mean, it can't be true. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. Um, I'll say so. When I looked into it, are you familiar with Seventh Day Adventism?